So today we're going to talk about the world's coral reefs, and essentially I'm going to go over the latest data which reviews that. It's very interesting. But to start off with, we've all heard the normal headlines about basically all the reefs are on their way out. 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is bleached and supposedly dead. 1.5 degrees will remove 99% of the world's corals, even those living in relatively cold climates by 2025. We've already had 1.2 degrees warming supposedly. So that extra 0.3 degrees is going to kill basically 98% or 99% of the coral. And, you know, Great Barrier Reef, 2% has escaped bleaching, implying that it's almost all dead. So what I'm going to do is go over the most important bits of the data from this report, which we published last month with the Global Warming Policy Foundation. You can go to that report if you like. But I'm going to start at more or less at the end and show you the data for the world's coral reef. So this is a date 1980 up to 2020, and this is the amount of coral essentially on the vertical axis, and you can see the line. By the way, the data before about the year 2000 has got a lot of error in it, or uncertainty in it, which is that blue bar. But you can see it goes up and down a little bit, but there's essentially no statistically different difference between the coral cover now to when records began. So, you know, this is not showing that there's a huge disaster happening. That's an average for the whole world. That just shows that data in the early area has a lot of uncertainty. If we go to the Great Barrier Reef, the situation is even better. We can show that we've actually got record high coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef. This is the area where we've got by far the best data, in fact. This despite bleaching events. These are these red bars. We had 4 massive bleaching events, supposedly, that devastated a whole heap of coral. And despite that, we've now got twice as much coral as we did just a decade ago. It's hardly a disaster. So the data sources that I'll be looking at are mostly from this organization here, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, which essentially writes reports for all the different regions, and they combine data from dozens of different countries and lots of different surveys, plus the stuff that comes out of the Australian government for the Great Barrier Reef and other parts of Australia. That's the main data source. So the Australian Institute of Marine Science does the long-term monitoring and has the longest record of coral reef monitoring in the world, going back to 1985. Still not a huge amount of time, but it's the best we've got. So I'm going to be looking at what's called the coral cover. We need to say what that is. So here's a picture of a coral reef, which has got 100% of the seabed is covered with coral, as you can see there. In fact, it's even more than 100% technically, I guess. The other extreme would be 0%, where there's absolutely no coral on the bottom. That's been blown away probably by a cyclone in that, or a hurricane in that picture. And then you've got in between areas where you've got a bit of coral here and there, but you've got dead bits or mud or sand or something like that. So that's what coral cover is. And this is essentially the data I'll be showing is an average of that over the whole world and other areas. Now, you shouldn't expect coral cover to be 100% of a coral reef. So this is a picture of Lodestone Reef on the Great Barrier Reef. And you can see out what we call the front of the reef, there is almost 100% coral cover there. But at the back of the reef, there's a whole lot of sand. So the coral cover there was probably down at about maybe 10%, maybe 15%. I should also add that we've got this area on the front of the reef, which is completely dead, 0% coral cover. And that's actually died from sea level fall, because on the Great Barrier Reef over the last 3,000 to 5,000 years, the sea level has fallen by about 1 meter. That's exposed the coral and killed it. So if we actually do get a bit more sea level rise than the pathetic amount we've had over the last 100 years, which is only sort of like about this much, then that area will explode with coral because it will once again be covered by seawater. But that's a little bit of a digression. We're going to look at the Coral Reef Monitoring Network, which, as you can see here, plots graphs for lots of regions around the world. And I'm essentially just going to use their data. I do almost nothing with it. Here and there, I have to add up a few numbers, but that's really the sum total of the analysis that I have to do. So we had before the world average, and we found that that is basically not changing a great deal. We need to actually discuss this data because there are huge problems with the data. The main problem being that it's actually really hard to monitor anything that's underwater. So we're trying to monitor the amount of coral on the seabed. You're inevitably going to be on scuba. The data I'll be looking at, because it's from lots of different countries over different time and hasn't been a rigid way of measuring it over that time, we have changing methods throughout. So the way they've actually done that has changed. I won't go into a lot of the details unless people want to later. They're not sampling the same places each year. So if you go to, say, the Philippines or Indonesia, they're not looking at the same reefs one year after another. They do for the Great Barrier Reef, but not for most other areas. There's different methods for different regions, which is a bit of a problem. And there's almost no randomization of the sampling location. So if you go back to that picture I showed you there, it depends hugely where you sample that reef as to what number you'll get. You get close to 100% on the front, you get about 20% on the back. So depending upon where you sample, you'll get a different number. So you've got to randomize those areas. There's very little documentation on how the actual data was taken, which is a problem. And the amount of data before 1998 is minimal. Now, that's because 1998 was when the proverbial hit the fan on climate change and coral reefs, and people started to really take an interest. So that's why there's high uncertainty before about the year 2000. And finally, there's a degree of subjectivity to most of the methods. So even the Australian Institute of Marine Science, they send a diver around the reef. They go around all the reefs. Huge job, massive job. And every 100 meters, the diver takes an estimate of the amount of coral on the seabed. Now, you may think that's terrible. They just look down and they say 25%. But in fact, if you train up the diver, you can get within 5 or 10%. So it's a matter of really training up the diver. And this is a similar process that's used in agriculture and other areas. So it's not as bad as you may think. It's the least of the major problems with the data. All right, now for the world, we saw that there was no reduction in coral cover. But if we go to the East Asian region, which has, you can see here, 30% of the world's coral reefs, the data as before, you see massive error before about the year 2000. The data is almost useless, actually, unless there was a massive change. But as you can see, there hasn't been a massive change. The amount of data we've got now is more or less the same as what it's ever been. You may think, well, it's declined since the 2010, but that's actually probably due to the changing in the sampling. And there's no statistical difference right across that period. So you're not seeing any dramatic decline in coral in the major region of the world in the last 20 years, when all the drama has come about climate change. If we look at the Pacific coral cover, and I'm pretty sure, David, this includes the Hawaiian Islands, though it's been averaged with just about everywhere else in the Pacific. So Hawaiian will disappear in this data. Even here, you may think there's a decline there, but if you look at the uncertainty bars and draw a line from the top of the 80% percentile, you can see there's no change there, either no statistical change in the amount of coral. If you go to the Caribbean, which has about 10% of the world's coral cover, I should say that the Pacific is about 25% of the world's coral, so a lot. The Caribbean, about 10%. Interestingly, the Caribbean has naturally got much lower coral cover on average, but no statistical difference in the amount of coral on the Caribbean either. So, you know, again, we're not looking at any major disaster here, certainly not over the last decades. Right, so we now look at the Great Barrier Reef in a little bit more detail. As I said before, it really is where we've got by far the best data. It's been using the same methodology. You can criticize the methodology, but it's the same methodology over the whole period. 15% of the world reefs just off here. So it's a lot. And you can see, as I said before, well, we're at record high coral cover. Now, we had bleaching events in, right around the world. You would have heard them. 2016, 17, 2020, 2022. And in that time, despite all that bleaching, the coral cover went from about 10% in 2012 up to 35% roughly today. So that's a bit embarrassing for the other side, you'd have to say. Now you might wonder, well, what's this low point from? Well, it's actually from crown of thorns starfish outbreaks, but mostly, in fact, due to two really big cyclones that went through in that period. And what we're seeing is the bounce back from those major events. One of those cyclones just went straight down the Great Barrier Reef, wiped out it wiped out more than half the coral in the southern area of the reef. And we've recovered from that really well. If we look at some of the detailed areas, so these are little segments of the Great Barrier Reef. This is about 10% of the Great Barrier Reef. You can see the coral cover from 1986. You see these massive swings, huge swings from the worst bit in 2010 after the cyclone, massive recovery. We've got about 2 to 3 times more coral in this sector. Now, of course, this is just wonderful for the doomsayers because there's always somewhere on the Great Barrier Reef that's crashing, right? So if you were here, they did proclaim the end of the world, that there's going to be no more coral by 2023. And we've got 3 times more. If you look at the 3 major regions of the reef, you do see these swings. Most of the swings, say in the southern region, that big drop was from cyclones. This drop here is the only one in any region which is actually from a bleaching event. All the others are not from bleaching. But you see phenomenal recovery from that in a relatively short period of time. But as I said before, the drops are always reported as a disaster. Nobody ever mentions the beautiful recoveries. So it's a gift for the doomsayers. Now, you might think that record high coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef is a good thing, right? You might think that, but it's not, okay? It's a bad thing. Now, in 2012, as I said, they were proclaiming the end of the world because we had a very little amount of coral. But sorry, guys, it's no better now. So if we actually look at, the BBC, we've got this type of coral here, which is called a Acropora, by the way. It's the branching coral, the plate coral. It's the most delicate. It's the one that gets hit by bleaching the most. It gets eaten by starfish, and it gets completely obliterated by cyclones. So you can imagine that in 2010, we had very little Acropora, almost no Acropora in huge areas of the reef because it had been wiped out by cyclones, right? And they were saying the Acropora loss was a disaster there. Well, what are they saying now? Well, the Great Barrier Reef sees record high coral, but it's still highly vulnerable. In fact, what they say is the rapid growth of coral cover appears to come at the expense of the diversity of coral on the reef, with most of the increase accounted for by the fast-growing branching coral called Acropora. These corals grow quickly after disturbances, but are very easily destroyed by storms, heat waves, and crown of thorns starfish. By increasing the dominance of those corals, Acropora, the reef has become more vulnerable. So it's worse because we've got all this incredibly vulnerable Acropora. Now, the thing is that we should have no Acropora because we had 4 massive bleaching events. So the bleaching events supposedly kill Acropora, and yet we've got record high coral cover. So you can see when we had almost no Acropora back in 2012, that was a disaster. And now we've got too much Acropora, and that's a disaster. So you can never win with these guys, and it'll always be doomed. So I actually, I should add, by the way, that the opposite of Acropora, these big, massive ones, they don't get worried by anything, more or less. They just go through everything. So the Acropora, which is the beautiful stuff, actually, in many ways, is what they're all worried about. Now, in my view, they're a bit like Dementors in Harry Potter. I don't know whether you follow the Harry Potter, but these are seriously nasty creatures that just suck the joy out of life. And this is what the coral reef and the climate Dementors are like. They glory in decay and despair. They drain the peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them, and they want to make children commit suicide, basically. Go too near a Dementor, and every good feeling, every happy memory is sucked out of you. This is what they're like. It doesn't matter how good the news is, they're not going to allow people to rejoice that the Great Barrier Reef is bloody beautiful. It's actually never been better since records began, and people should be very, very happy about that. All right, so that's the data. The data shows that the reef is in really quite wonderful condition, and we shouldn't be too concerned about it. So I'm just checking the time. But we do need to look at the situation of mass bleaching. What is mass bleaching? Because most people around the world have no idea. I said before, it's a story made in heaven, because it's true that sometimes when the water gets really hot, a lot of coral dies. It's a bit like the trees out west here. If you get a really bad hot year, you're going to lose a lot of trees. So it's sort of plausible in the sense that coral does die from hot water occasionally, and it's very spectacular. The coral goes white, it bleaches. But let's have a look at some facts. Well, the first thing is that corals grow much faster in warmer climates, right? So the corals on the Great Barrier Reef here grow considerably slower than in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea north of here, where it's 1 to 2 degrees hotter. Bleaching actually kills very little coral, especially compared with cyclones on the Great Barrier Reef. Right? As I said before, we've had 4 supposedly devastating bleaching events, and we've got record high coral cover. So that just shows you how bad bleaching is. And it turns out that, in fact, corals are better able to cope with rising temperatures than virtually any other organism on Earth, and we'll explain why. It's called shuffling the zooxanthellae, and it's incredible what these guys do. Now, bleaching is a little bit like in Australia, we have, extreme events every year, all the time, and it looks bad, but we get recovery. Same as the case underwater. We have a bleaching event, looks bad, we get recovery. It's Australia, and it's the same for many parts of the world. Firstly, let's look at some data for the coral growth rate relative to temperature. So we have 23 degrees here, really cold, too cold for coral, really, and you get relatively slow growth rates. Really hot water around Thailand, very fast growth rates. Torres Strait, Northern Australia, a bit slower. Northern Great Barrier Reef, a bit slower. Southern Great Barrier Reef, you're getting colder because you're in the Southern Hemisphere, remember. You're getting colder. Down here, this is for David, you're talking about the Hawaiian Islands. You're getting pretty, well, certainly the Northern Hawaiian Islands, you're getting pretty cold, really too cold. If we get 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, you can see that we're going to get a considerable increase in growth rate. It's probably already a measurable effect even now. In fact, it's a different data set to look at that. But we should predict increasing growth, better corals in warmer climates. You don't go to Ireland or Scotland or Alaska to see coral. You go to the tropics where it's warm. Warm is good. It's obvious. Anybody can see that. There's a place north of Australia, and they call it the Coral Triangle because it's got the best, most diverse, fastest growing coral on Earth. And guess what? They call it, well, the oceanographers call it the Indo-Pacific warm pool because it's where the hottest water is on Earth. This is the heat engine of the atmosphere. Hottest water, best coral. It's obvious. Now let's have a look at coral. Now coral is an animal. It's made up of, inside these corals, there's a whole bunch of little polyps, a little pot of calcium carbonate, almost as hard as concrete. And inside that animal lives a plant, well, it's sort of like a plant, an algae called zooxanthellae. And this is a symbiotic relationship between the animal and the plant. The plant gets energy from the sun because it's got chlorophyll, and it passes some of that to the polyp animal, and they live in a nice, happy relationship until they don't. They sort of fall out in hot water, cold water, fresh water. When the coral is sick, what happens is the zooxanthellae is ejected from the coral, and that loses the energy source. So it's bad when that happens. Now, when that algae is ejected, because the color of the coral actually comes from the algae, it loses the color. The coral loses the color and it goes white, like this coral here, or some of that coral. And that then stresses the coral, but mostly what will happen is the coral won't die. It will actually then take back the zooxanthellae within a few weeks to months. The zooxanthellae is just floating around in the water, always has done. Bleaching is roughly like an analogy in Australian trees. When they have a really bad drought, they will drop their leaves. It looks really bad, but they'll grow them back. Now, it turns out that corals are born, when they're a little baby coral, they have no zooxanthellae. They take it around, they take it from the water it's floating around in the water. And there are lots and lots of different species of zooxanthellae. And the type of zooxanthellae that the coral will take in, they can decide that. And the type they take in can be better or worse depending on when you're a hot or a cold climate. So it's brilliant. You can actually change your heat adaptability by just changing the zooxanthellae during bleaching events. So bleaching events are part of the adaptive response mechanism to changing climates, which change all the time. And I'm not talking about over long periods. If you're a coral and you release your spawn, that spawn could go to the north of Australia where it's really hot, or to the southern Great Barrier Reef where it's really cold. So you need to be able to adapt to lots of different temperatures. So the zooxanthellae lives inside the coral, and I should go to the next section. And essentially, if the coral takes in what I'd call a low octane zooxanthellae, that's good in the sense it will give resistance to bleaching, but it will grow really slow. So, you know, you can do that if you like, but you'll grow really slow, and that's not good. Or you can take a high octane zooxanthellae, which might make you very susceptible to bleaching, so you might die from that, but you'll grow real fast. So there's this juggling act which the corals are doing all the time, shuffling the zooxanthellae. So the thing is that after bleaching, they'll often take in a different species of zooxanthellae because they thought, well, that was the wrong one. I got hot, I got bleached. I'll take in a different type, which is more adaptable. Now, how they do that, we've got no idea. It's a mystery. It's an incredible mystery that we really need to know more about. Now, it turns out these Acropora are the ones that tend to get bleached. They grow real fast. They're wiped out by cyclones. They only have a 20-year, maybe 30-year life anyway. So they try to live, they go fast, they get susceptible to bleaching, and so they tend to die from bleaching more than the big block corals. So what you're seeing here is not the canary in the coal mine, some delicate organism that can just be knocked over. They're more like cockroaches. You can have a nuclear conflagration, you can have a huge climate event, and these things are going to live just like cockroaches are going to live because they can deal with changing climates. And of course, they've been around for a couple 100 million years. They've been through incredible upheavals. Corals are tough, right? That doesn't mean to say that you can just obliterate them and take them for granted, but they are tough. Now, a little bit of a branch off here. The problem is that, yes, all right, we've got these record high coral, and people want to trust the institutions. We all want to trust the institutions who are saying that the reef is that all the reefs are damaged and it's going to be the end of the world sort of thing. So you show them a picture like this, and you show record high coral cover, and you say, well, this means the institutions have been basically getting it wrong, and they don't want to believe that, right? They don't want to believe that the BBC and the Washington Post and the Royal Society and the Irish Academy of Science or whatever you have there are actually untrustworthy. They'd actually rather believe the doom story that all the coral reefs of the world are dying than these trusted institutions. Like, they're like grandma. They're like you've got to believe the BBC. I used to. We all used to. A lot of us did. We used to believe the Royal Society, but we don't want to now disbelieve that. And a lot of people are in a difficult situation that if you're going to believe that we really have record high coral cover and that is good, it's not bad, then the corollary is all these institutions have been lying to you. And that is a horrible thought for most people. And they don't want to believe that, but they're coming around. Now something's gone wrong here. We seem to have. Moving on. Now, I was asked to talk about the situation I had with James Cook University, my employer for a fair bit of my career. So I'll just go in briefly. I don't like to talk about it hugely because it's sort of a bit self-indulgent, but anyway, I will. So what happened was I've been working on the Great Barrier Reef as a physicist, designing instruments a lot, taking a huge number of measurements. We invented the instruments for measuring the sediment concentrations on the reef. And in the 1990s, we were demonstrating that there was this argument that farmers were killing the reef due to sediment coming off the reef and smothering the coral, etc. And we were able to demonstrate that that's complete rubbish. I won't go into the details. But none of this was being believed, that the biologists were saying, no, the farmers are still killing the reef. They still do. Right? And I couldn't understand, well, why aren't they believing the data? We had all the data. We were the guys who were actually measuring this stuff. Even to this day, my group at JCU has taken more measurements of sediment on the Great Barrier Reef than all the other groups put together, but we were not believed. And I thought, well, okay, they're not believing me on my work. This is very annoying, but presumably all the other work on the Great Barrier Reef is rock solid. So I then started to look into a lot of that, and you could see quite clearly that it wasn't rock solid. They were making things up, and I started to try to publish papers refuting this stuff. So in about 2004 or 5, there was just a crazy paper claiming that the reefs were, 50% of the way to extinction. I demonstrated this was complete rubbish. And up to that point, I'd never had a paper not accepted by a journal. I've never been refused, and they wouldn't even take this paper into review. I just couldn't believe what had happened. And then this happened again and again and again. Sometimes I'd be able to publish in the Indian Journal of Marine Science, which actually is a good journal, but it wasn't my journal of choice. And it was becoming more and more difficult. I started to lose funding. I was a big hitter in the funding for the Australian Research Council. I couldn't get funding. It didn't affect me too much because we were doing a lot of commercial work for the university, and I was able to divert a lot of the profits of that into my research. So it didn't matter too much, but I lost funding. And then I started to read up about the replication crisis in science, where right across science, about 50% of the peer-reviewed literature is wrong. And I started to realize we have this massive quality assurance problem right across science, but definitely I could demonstrate it in the Great Barrier Reef. So things got really bad in 2016 when I pointed out that this island, supposedly surrounded by a coral reef, big island, they were saying all the coral had gone, right? There was no coral on this. It had all been killed by mostly by farmers, actually. And we said, well, we put some divers down there and said, well, there's lots of coral here, so where's the quality assurance? And I got into a lot of trouble. I was censured for that by the university. I was told to shut up about it. And then a year and a half later, I published a chapter in the Institute of Public Affairs book, Climate Change, the Facts, on essentially some of this information you've seen here. And I said there's a huge quality assurance problem in Great Barrier Reef science, and a lot of the institutions are not trustworthy because they're not doing proper quality assurance. And that was really bad. I was again told to shut up, and they started procedures to fire me. We ended up taking it through the courts. We won in the first round. We weren't unfortunately arguing on the science. We were arguing on the principle of free speech, that I had academic freedom of speech. The university disagreed. It ended up going to the High Court, and we ended up winning on the main principle, but we lost on this slightly crazy technicality. I guess it's the law, and I don't want to appear like I'm too bitter, because I'm actually not bitter about this. In terms of all the bad things that happen in the world, like children dying of cancer and all this type of stuff, losing in the High Court is just a teeny weeny injustice. But anyway, the High Court ruled, this is the highest court in Australia. It's like the American Supreme Court. They said that JCU, my university, acted unlawfully in censuring me. So they were not allowed to censure me and say, you can't say that, and do really nasty things to me. And they upheld the primacy of academic freedom of speech, which was a first for Australia, because that had never happened before in the court. So that was really good. But they said, and this was the strange thing, but they said that JCU still had the right to fire me because I spoke in public about the university's unlawful activity. They'd given me a confidentiality directive, so they told me not to speak about their activity. So despite me having academic freedom of speech, I wasn't allowed to talk about their unlawful activity. They were essentially saying that because those comments were outside my field of interest, which is I'm a physicist, I can talk about the reef and instruments, but I'm not allowed to talk about their unlawful activity, despite the fact that my work contract specifically says that I can talk about decisions made within the university. So a lot of legal commentators in Australia raised some eyebrows about this. But anyway, that's the law apparently. It's all over. We did win on the principle, and there are some other cases in Australia where academics seem to be using this new right of academic freedom of speech. So not all bad news at all. So that brings me to the universities. And of course, you can have all the rights of freedom of speech you like, but for the average scientist, the reality is that the peer review system means that you cannot go outside the prevailing wisdom, because you cannot get your papers published and you can't get funding. So the system of peer review is a rigid enforcer of the conventional wisdom. It's the best recipe that you could possibly think of for making groupthink, and groupthink has spread right across the scientific system. This is especially so because most university academics are on the, not just the left, but on the extreme left, you know, the virtually, well, very, very extreme. So we have this huge problem in the universities, even if technically you have freedom of speech. As we all know, conservative dissent is almost completely crushed. But the main problem actually is that almost all academics are on the extreme left. So you don't have universities, you have monoversities, no diversity of thought, though there's diversity of just about everything else in terms of your DNA, but not in terms of thought, which is the most important thing. So you've got to ask the question, are any of these salvageable? Are the universities salvageable? I think some are. You saw some very good things happening at the University of Cambridge, where their Vice-Chancellor wanted to restrict speech to being, I forgot the exact words, but you had to be nice basically all the time. And the Cambridge academics rebelled against that. A couple of very brave ones started, but once they got to a secret vote, 80%, I think, of Cambridge University academics wanted to be able to have genuine free speech within the university. So that's a really good thing. We've got a university in Australia, which is a semi-private one called Bond, which seems to be a little bit more liberal in terms of what people are allowed to say. So there's an academic there who's saying things about another very controversial issue. You can probably guess what it is, around the world. And he seems to be able to get away with it, whereas my university is more like probably 95%. So I think some are salvageable, but mostly you're going to have to write off these universities. They're so infiltrated by the extreme left that you can't do much about it. So I think we need to start new universities. It's the only way. A conservative governments have got, not that you've got a conservative government in the UK or our neo-conservative government in Australia last time wasn't. It was actually a left-wing government, effectively. They need to have new universities. We need scientific red teams where you decide, well, this is the conventional wisdom. We are going to challenge it. We are going to fund a challenge. We're going to employ people to try to smash the conventional wisdom. And if they can't, that's great, right? But if they can, well, we're ahead. If you want scientific dissent, you need to pay for it. It's the only way to do it. I've been suggesting that we should have 5% of the Australian Research Council fund should go to doing replication studies to challenge the conventional wisdom. You've got to set aside money to do that. And we need alternative universities to start from scratch, to be deliberately different to the present universities. And finally, I'd like to say that, you know, I got fired from a university, you know, too bad, so sad. I'm an old fella now, I'm in my early 60s. It wasn't like it was a huge disaster for me. It was personally upsetting and all the rest of it. And it wasn't nice being chased through the court sort of thing. But in the end, I could do it because I was an old fella and I got superannuation. But if you're a young person, or when I was a young person, I couldn't have done that because you have your mortgage, you have your children, you've got to just suck it up, guy. So there is actually a duty of older academics. If you're at a university and you're an older academic and your superannuation is okay, you have a duty to challenge your university on these things and risk being fired. And if you get fired, great, right? Make sure everybody knows about it. You have a duty to the younger academics to take the risk that they can't afford to take. We need the academics to be able to come out of under a rock. There are lots of academics. There might be a small number in fraction, but there are still plenty of them who are on the other side to give a diversity of thought. And it's only the older academics who can do those challenges. And I recommend any older academic who's listening here, do the right thing for your university and the whole world's university system. And on that, I think I'll leave it.